Well, this is one of the most surprising things I've ever seen. I couldn't believe that Richard Dawkins, of all people, would say that he's a cultural Christian. Stay tuned for more on how Christianity led to freedom, capitalism, and the success of the West. But I suppose people are backtracking a bit now and saying, some of the atheists are backtracking and saying that they're surprised that things have gotten worse in the West. I think there's a lot of negative things that have occurred due to the declining state of religion. I think that the rise in mental illness is part of the problem. I think that people are less happy. I think that the community life has suffered. I think that there is a decline in the pursuit of individual liberty. And individual liberty and spontaneous order, that's what capitalism happened to be. People think of capitalism as greed, but greed is an unfortunate human trait that will exist regardless of which system you pick for your economic uh, situation. Although capitalism, again, is really not even a system at all. It's really the lack of a system, unlike everything else. So let's watch this video real quick with Dawkins.
What would you tell the nation?
Well, I must say I was slightly horrified to hear that Ramadan is being promoted instead. I do think that we are culturally a Christian country. I call myself a cultural Christian. I'm not a believer, but there's a distinction between being a believing Christian and being a cultural Christian. And so, I love hymns and Christmas carols, and I sort of feel at home in the Christian ethos. I feel that we are a Christian country in that sense. It's true that statistically the number of people who actually believe in Christianity is going down, and I'm happy with that. But I would not be happy if, for example, we lost all our cathedrals and our beautiful parish churches. So I count myself a cultural Christian. I think it would matter if we substituted any alternative religion. That would be truly dreadful.
Well, which brings me to my supplementary point, which is that, as we know, church attendance is plummeting, but the erection of mosques across Europe, I think 6,000 are under construction, and there are many more, are being planned. So do you regard that as a problem? Do you think that matters?
Yes, I do, really. I mean, I must choose my words carefully. I mean, if I had to choose between Christianity and Islam, I'd choose Christianity every single time. I mean, it seems to me to be a fundamentally decent religion, in a way that I think Islam is not.
I think you're going to have to explain why you say that, Professor Dawkins. Why is Islam fundamentally not decent like Christianity?
Yes, I mean, the way women are treated. I mean, Christianity is not great about that. It's had its problems with female vicars and female bishops and things. But there's an active hostility to women, which is promoted, I think, by the holy books of Islam. I'm not talking about individual Muslims, who, of course, are quite different. But the doctrines of Islam, the hadiths and the Quran, is fundamentally hostile to women, hostile to gays, and I find that I like to live in a culturally Christian country, although I do not believe a single word of the Christian faith. Virgin for a mother, do you actually believe he rose from the dead? I suspect
well,
weirdly, you probably don't.
since you asked, Richard, if I may, because I was at New College when you were.
They're getting off track here. What she was trying to ask is what is it about Christianity that's beneficial to the West? And I think it's individual liberty. The Christians have pushed the worldview that people have this intrinsic value, and that needs to be promoted. Christianity is the religion of love. I'd say Buddhism, it might be the religion of inner peace, and Islam is what? The religion of subjugation. It doesn't seem like it's historically been all that anti-slavery. If you look at Indonesia, the Muslims have taken over Indonesia and brought back slavery. You have in Nigeria churches being burnt down.
That's a very clear answer from you, Richard Dawkins. Thank you so much.
All right. I don't know. He was somewhat helpful there, but not as much as I would have liked. So here we have another article from The Independent talking about how Christianity led to freedom, capitalism, and the success of the West. And I think that's very true. It says, when Europeans first began to explore the globe, their greatest surprise was not the existence of the Western Hemisphere, but the extent of their own technological superiority over the rest of the world. Not only were the proud Maya, Aztec, and Inca nations helpless in the face of European intruders, so were the fabled civilizations of East China, India, and Islamic nations were backward by comparison with 15th century Europe. How had that happened? Why was it that, although many civilizations had pursued alchemy, the study led to chemistry only in Europe? Why was it that for centuries Europeans were the only ones possessed of eyeglasses, chimneys, reliable rocks, and heavy cavalry, or of a system of music notation? Also, I would point out that a Christian and Anglican came up with the scientific method, so there seems to be some consistency here. Several recent authors have discovered the secret to Western success in geography, but that same geography long also sustained European cultures that were well behind those of Asia. Geography is a good explanation for why you moved from hunter-gatherer societies to farming societies, or what you had some uh, oxen around or whatever, animals anyways, that you used to plow your fields. So that's certainly relevant to some extent. But lots of places, lots of civilizations around the world embraced farming. Now, the industrialization of the world, that's a completely different thing, or of your country. That's much more complicated, in my opinion. I mean, people were hunters and gatherers for tens of thousands of years, farmers for thousands of years. Industrialization has only happened in the past few hundred years. So that's quite a trend, quite a difference. European cultures that were well behind those. Other commentators have traced the rise of West to steel or to guns and sailing ships, and still others have credited a more productive agriculture. Those are all useful, but that's like first stage economic development. The question is, I think, what leads you past that? Why did Europeans excel at metallurgy, shipbuilding, or farming? The most convincing answer to those questions attributes Western dominance to the rise of capitalism, which took place only in Europe. Even the most militant enemies of capitalism credit it with creating previously undreamed of productivity and progress. In the Communist Manifesto, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels proposed that before the rise of capitalism, humans engaged in the most slothful indolence. The capitalist system was the first to show what man's activity can bring about. Capitalism achieved that miracle through regular reinvestment to increase productivity, either to create greater capacity or to improve technology, and by motivating both management and labor through. I don't need to read this whole thing, I guess, but I would also add to that they ended slavery. That was a pretty big deal. Capitalists the Western world argued in favor of that. The first nation to do it might have been the Serenissima Republic of Venice, predominantly Catholic country in the 800s. I have an article on that on the Unschool Substack from a year ago, so you might check that out if you're interested. The history of ending slavery, the Christian history of ending slavery, goes back quite a long ways. Some of the first religious leaders in the 1 and 200, popes, if you want to call them that, were also former slaves. But it would be difficult in the Roman Empire to be arguing against slavery. You'd probably get killed. And in fact, quite a lot of early religious leaders were killed. A lot of the early popes were killed. Anyway, supposing that capitalism did produce Europe's own great leap forward, it remains to be explained why capitalism developed only in Europe. Some writers have found the roots of capitalism in the Protestant Reformation. And that's a great point as well. I mean, the Protestant work ethic, I think, that is probably the true origin of capitalism. The stuff that came prior to that is more like ideas, but not true capitalism, not true freedom from the state, so that you could pursue your own self-interest. Others have traced it back to various circumstances, but if one digs deeper, it becomes clear that the truly fundamental basis, not only for capitalism, but for the rise of the West, was an extraordinary faith in reason and in people's brain power. That's really what gets you past a few $1,000s per year in GDP per capita. A lot of these countries, they embrace a literal industrialization run by the state, and then their income level is only a few $1,000s. If they want to get as rich as some of these Western countries, they want to get as rich as the United States, the government has to get out of the way and let people pursue their own self-interest. A series of developments in which reason won the day gave unique shape to Western culture and institutions, and the most important of those victories occurred within Christianity, while the other world religions emphasized mystery and intuition. Christianity alone embraced reason and logic as the primary guides to religious truth. Christian faith and reason was influenced by Greek philosophy, but the more important fact is that Greek philosophy had little impact on Greek religions. Those remain typical mystery cults in which ambiguity and logical contradictions were taken as hallmarks of sacred origins. Similar assumptions concerning the fundamental inexplicability of the gods and the intellectual superiority of introspection dominated all of the other major world religions. But from the early days, this church fathers taught that reason was a supreme gift from God and the means to progressively increase understanding of Scripture and revelation. Consequently, Christianity was oriented to the future, while the other major religions asserted the superiority of the past. At least in principle, if not always in fact, Christian doctrines could always be modified in the name of progress, as demonstrated by reason. And we see this going forward. I mean, there's quite a lot of people that are Christians that do support evolution, maybe differing understandings of evolution. Some people only believe in microevolution. Some people believe in a more full-on approach to evolution that says that we came from some primordial sludge. But Christians still have a tendency to accept things as we learn more about our world. And a big part of that, in my opinion, is just that the overarching worldview of Christianity and of science is to discover more about the world. And I don't want to say Christians invented science, but they certainly wrote wrote the rules of it. I mean, coming up with the scientific method is a pretty big deal. Coming up with the Big Bang theory is a pretty big deal. They still use we still use the Gregorian calendar, which comes from Pope Gregory. In the 1500s, Christians managed to get the calendar within a second. I think that's amazing. 500 years ago, with primitive technology, that's amazing. It says here the rise of capitalism also was a victory for church-inspired reason, since capitalism is in essence the systematic and sustained application of reason to commerce, something that first took place within the great monastic estates. I would also say it's spontaneous order, and honestly, some economists use that explanation of spontaneous order, right? The world, the universe is spontaneous. Human beings go out and order it. I think it was Murray Rothbard that wrote Economics before Adam Smith, which discussed spontaneous order as an origin of true capitalist belief. But obviously, that comes from the ancient Taoists, as he pointed out. But they weren't talking about economics; they were talking about the entire universe. And some of those ancient Chinese philosophies are still useful in some ways. Um, I guess one of the problems maybe with Buddhism is that it tends to push you towards a worldview that your decisions don't really matter. It's more mystical, and the Protestant work ethic really pushes the narrative that you need to get out there and make something of yourself. You need to improve your own life to meet God's will. And I think the Protestant work ethic is essentially that idea that you work through God. Even if you're just plowing your fields, you're doing it for God, which is a heck of a motivator. Big motivator over doing it because you're enslaved or something like that. Anyways, during the past century, Western intellectuals have been more than willing to trace European imperialism to Christian origins, but they have been entirely unwilling to recognize that Christianity made any contribution other than intolerance to the Western capacity to dominate other societies. Rather, the West is said to have surged ahead precisely as it overcame religious barriers to progress, especially those impeding science. Nonsense. The success of the West, let's remember as well that a lot of those Christians were the biggest advocates for education, right? Who created the university system? Catholics. Who decided to educate everyone? Protestants. That's been the case for hundreds of years, right? So they were the biggest advocates for education. They went around the world. They taught people how to read. Sometimes their motivations, of course, were to convert people. Like, well, we're going to teach you how to read, and we're going to do it with the Bible. So some people will look down on that and say, well, you had ulterior motives. But, most people are pretty happy to learn how to read. They think they like that. It's an extra, little thing that you can do to pass the time. The success of the West, including the rise of science, rested entirely on religious foundations. The people who brought it about were devout Christians. Unfortunately, even in the United States, by the way, like I don't think that the U.S. was founded uh, to have religious institutions. We were against that. We wanted secular institutions, but it's quite obvious in early writings that the founding fathers were very religious. Our Declaration of Independence mentions God a couple of times, God and the Creator. Unfortunately, even many of those historians willing to grant Christianity a role in shaping Western progress have tended to limit themselves to tracing beneficial religious effects of the Protestant Reformation. It is as if the previous 1,500 years of Christianity either were of little matter or were harmful. Couldn't be further from the truth. Such academic anti Roman Catholicism inspired the most famous book ever written on the origins of capitalism. At the start of the 20th century, the German sociologist Max Weber published what soon became an immensely influential study, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. In it, Weber proposed that capitalism originated only in Europe because of all the world's religions. Only Protestantism provided a moral vision that led people to restrain their material consumption while vigorously seeking wealth. Weber argued that before the Reformation, restraint on consumption was invariably linked to an asceticism and hence to condemnations of commerce. Conversely, the pursuit of wealth was linked to profligate consumption. Either cultural pattern was inimical to capitalism. According to Weber, the Protestant ethic shattered those traditional linkages, creating a culture of frugal entrepreneurs subject content to systematically reinvest profits in order to pursue even greater wealth. And therein lies the key to capitalism and ascendancy of the West. I think there's some truth to that, but I don't think you have to cancel Catholicism or any other religious denomination to hold up Protestants. I do think that Protestants were influential in pursuing capitalism and in educating the general populace. That's pretty important. But I also look to Thomas Sowell's books to where he points out that there are certain groups that were pro commerce, and a lot of them were historically discriminated against as a result. And some of those would be obviously Jewish people have been discriminated against because of that. Um, he talks about ancient Japan and how samurai culture was very anti-commerce. So that's pretty unfortunate that they would not be for that sort of thing. There's Confucians, maybe. You had the Silk Road in China, and they were in some ways pro-commerce, right? So that's beneficial. And there's other books that you might check out, like Culture Matters and the Central Liberal Truth, which discusses the differences between the left and the right, but how they've influenced the West. They're not all negative. They're actually talking about positive things. The left tends to be more pro uh, secular institutions, and the right tends to be more for promoting cultural influences in the West. So right now we're talking mostly about cultural influences, but I think that those Christians did have a heavy-handed influence in creating secular institutions that allowed people of originally differing Christian denominations to work together in harmony, and then later other groups as well. Perhaps because it was an elegant thesis, it was widely embraced, despite the fact that it was so obviously wrong. Even today, the Protestant ethic enjoys an almost sacred status among sociologists. And a big part of the reason for that is because there's so many Marxists. And I wouldn't associate Marxism with Protestants. Don't get me wrong. I'm just saying that the Marxists hate Catholics, and all the derivative denominations of Marxism tend to hate that as well. Although economic historians quickly dismissed Weber's surprisingly undocumented monograph on the irrefutable grounds that the rise of capitalism in Europe preceded the Reformation by centuries, only a decade after Weber published, the celebrated Belgian scholar Henry Perrenne noted a large literature that established the fact that all of the essential features of capitalism, individual enterprise, advances in credit, commercial profit, speculation, etc., are to be found from the 12th century on in the city republics of Italy, Venice, Genoa, or Florence. Well, some of those go back to the 800s. Again, the Catholic city states So were some of the first to end slavery. The Serenissima Republic of Venice in the 800s, the Republic of Ragusa in the 1400s, and then I don't know all of the history, but they're mentioning other places from the 12th century on. Well, we see Venice there again, right, and but Genoa and Florence, I don't really know much about their history, but it could be something interesting to look into. A generation later, the equally celebrated French historian Fernand Braudel complained all historians have opposed this tenuous theory, although they have not managed to be rid of it once and for all. Yet it is clearly false. The northern countries took over the place that earlier had so long and brilliantly been occupied by the old capitalist centers of the Mediterranean. They invented nothing, either in technology or business management. Braudel might have added that during their critical period of economic development, those northern centers of capitalism were Catholic, not Protestant. The Reformation still lay well into the future. Further, as the Canadian historian John Gilchrist, an authority on the economic activity of the medieval church, pointed out, first examples of capitalism appeared in the great Christian monasteries. So again, I think a big part of that is the push for education, educating wider swaths of people. The Catholics did not do a good job early on of educating everyone. The first people to be educated were going to be the people, the monks in the monasteries, and then priests and deacons and so on. But I do think that the Protestants did make a big effort to educate wider swaths of people, and the Protestants did make huge efforts to end slavery. And ending slavery, you have to end slavery to have capitalism, right? Because capitalism is individual liberty. If you don't have individual liberty, if people can't pursue their own positive self-interest, then you certainly don't have capitalism. So that was a big factor. It says here, though Weber was wrong, however, he was correct to suppose that religious ideas played a vital role in the rise of capitalism in Europe. The material conditions needed for capitalism existed in many civilizations in various eras, including China. Well, I mentioned that earlier. The Islamic world, I mean, it was pro-slavery. Like the Islamic world engaged in a ridiculous amount of castration and enslavement of Slavs and Africans. India, to some extent, Byzantium. So it is interesting how a lot of these societies didn't develop full on capitalism. A big part of the reason I think is their inability to completely end slavery. That's not a easy thing to do. It's actually quite challenging. Um, so but it says here, but none of these societies broke through and developed capitalism, as none evolved ethical visions compatible with the dynamic economic system. Instead, leading religions outside the West called for asceticism and denounced profits. Yeah. So a big part of that, and Thomas Sowell has some great information on this, is that historically people have looked down on others who sold things that they didn't produce themselves. So we don't really feel that way. We've developed a normalization of that in the West, right? We have stores all over the place, and we still look positively on people who sell things that they didn't necessarily make themselves. Often, most times, they don't make it themselves. We look down on some companies sometimes, like the Walmarts of the world, if they're acquiring their materials in some way that we find unethical. Some people criticize the creation of, the batteries for electric cars and so on, or how we acquire oil or what have you. You can decide whether for yourself how you feel about those issues. I'm just using them as examples. Instead, leading religions outside the West, blah blah blah. While wealth was exacted from peasants and merchants by rapacious elites dedicated to display and consumption. Why? And even here's the funny thing about that, and it's completely distorted in history in the way that people are taught. Okay, um, even even potlatch festivals in the Pacific Northwest were this displays of wealth, and they totally lie about that. The Marxists act like they were these egalitarian utopias. No, potlatch festivals. If you look it up, read some articles on JSTOR or something, you'll see that they actually often were slave murder fests, and the point was to show that you could do that. Like, oh, you could disperse with your slaves and continue living because you were rich enough that it didn't really matter. So that's pretty messed up. It says, why did things turn out differently in Europe? Because of the Christian commitment to rational theology, something that may have played a major role in causing the Reformation, but that surely predated Protestantism by far more than a millennium. Right? I think the Reformation, a big reason for that was that that the end of Rome and also the collapse of the Byzantine Empire led to a huge power vacuum in Europe, and the Catholic Church took that up and in some ways did become corrupt, and that caused a lot of problems. So when things get too far in one direction, then people feel the need to correct it. So capitalism only developed in some areas, some of those Catholic city states, as we discussed before. Why not all? Because in some European societies, as in most of the rest of the world, it was prevented from happening by greedy despots. Freedom also was essential for the development of capitalism. I mean, that's the essence of it, basically. You have to end slavery to have capitalism. That raises another matter. Why has freedom so seldom existed in most of the world, and how was it nurtured in some medieval European states? That too was a victory of reason. Before any medieval European state actually attempted rule by an elected council, Christian theologians had long been theorizing about the nature of equality and individual rights. Indeed, the later work of such secular 18th century political theorists as John Locke explicitly rested on egalitarian axioms derived from church scholars. I would also add to that, even in the corrupted humanities on college campuses, they still talk about the Dunbar number. And the Dunbar number is this idea that there's 150 people or so that you really hold close to you, right? Your family and friends, that's your actual group, is that 150 people. So getting people to give a shit about others outside of the 150 is actually more challenging than people want to believe. And a litany of philosophers have theorized on how that happens exactly. Even the great Adam Smith did that in Theory of Moral Sentiments, saying that, even though you have your group, your family that you care about the most, we do empathize with other people. But the flip side of that, you're more concerned with losing your thumb, having your thumb getting cut off, than you are about 1 million people dying on the other side of the planet, right? That's from his first book, Theory of Moral Sentiments. And later, he obviously, 20 years later, roughly, he wrote Wealth of Nations, which he's better known for. But it is interesting that the guy who's considered the first economist, right? The truly first economist, his first book was on empathy, right? What was Karl Marx's earlier works? 20 years before he wrote Das Kapital, he wrote an angry, racist, anti-Semitic book called On the Jewish Question. Big difference there. And then John Locke, life, liberty, property, right? That's incredibly important. Property is a huge part of capitalist society. Without property, you can't really have it. And without a right to property. And even if you think about in the U.S., the poorest people in the country tend to be the ones where the government told people where to live. Whether you're talking about native reservations or Section 8 housing, those people have a hard time getting out of that because as Javier Milei says in Argentina, the government doesn't create wealth, right? It takes it and this is definitely not an exact quote, but it doesn't create wealth. It takes it and tries to redistribute it, but doesn't do a very good job. All of this stemmed from the fact that from the earliest days, the major theologians taught that faith and reason was intrinsic to faith in God. As Quintus Tertullian instructed in the 2nd century, reason is a thing of God, inasmuch as there is nothing with which God, the maker of all, has not provided, disposed, ordained by reason. Nothing which he has not willed should be handled and understood by reason. Consequently, it was assumed that reason held the key to progress in understanding Scripture, and that knowledge of God and the secrets of his creation would increase over time. St. Augustine flatly asserted that through the application of reason, we will gain an increasingly more accurate understanding of God, remarking that although there are certain matters pertaining to the doctrine of salvation that we cannot yet grasp, one day we shall be able to do so. Well, so isn't that interesting? And I think that science is, the purpose of science is to discover more about the world. And, even Einstein posited about the God particle, posited on the God particle. So it seems to me that there's people who are trying to discover more and more. And, hopefully over time we will. Nor was the Christian belief in progress limited theology. Augustine went on at length about the wonderful, one might say, stupefying advances human industry has made, all were attributed to the unspeakable boon that God had conferred upon his creation a rational nature. Those views were repeated again and again through the centuries. Especially typical were these words preached by Fra Giordano in Florence in 1306. Not all the arts have been found. We shall never see an end of finding them. Wow, that's prophetic. 1300s. Imagine, I mean, the amount of things we've created since then. And not just paintings, right, as they would have done back then, but quite a lot of modern technology is a form of art in a way. And so that's pretty amazing. And yeah. So a big part of the rise of capitalism has to do with this belief that people are mostly, you know, at least attempting to be rational, right? Their own rational self-interest. That's the essence of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, is that people are pursuing that. Obviously, there are exceptions to the rule, but people who are Christian, people who are capitalist, can understand that there are Christians to the rule. It's the socialists and the fascists that believe that everyone has to fit into the exact same collective. Rational people understand that whatever average you might discuss, there's still always going to be exceptions. Christian faith in reason and progress was the foundation on which Western success was achieved. As the distinguished philosopher Alfred North Whitehead put it during one of his Lowell lectures at Harvard in 1925, science arose only in Europe because only there did people think that science could be done and should be done, a faith derivative from medieval theology. Moreover, the medieval Christian faith in reason and progress was constantly reinforced by actual progress, by technical and organizational innovations, many of them fostered by Christianity. For the past several centuries, far too many of us have been misled by the incredible fiction that from the fall of Rome until about the 15th century, Europe was submerged in the Dark Ages. Yeah, it is an incredible fiction because again, the Catholics were creating the first university system starting in the 1200s and moving forward. I mean, obviously the Black Death was incredibly detrimental to human progress. It killed quite possibly a third of Europe, and there's no way getting around that. But it wasn't like people were completely backwards. Nowadays, we just have more information available to us. We're not really smarter than people a century ago. It's just easier to find information and easier to be uh, chill and peaceful when your belly's full. But anyways, from which it was suddenly almost miraculously rescued, first by the Renaissance and then by the Enlightenment. But as even dictionaries and encyclopedias have recently begun to acknowledge, it was all a lie. There's been a lot of nonsense pushed, in the past 50 years. I read a book called Constant Battles, which discussed how we'd basically been fooled by the hippie generation in everything from archaeology to anthropology, uh, and the way that they push these narratives that human beings were peaceful prior to capitalism, which is not really true. Ancient humans from tens of thousands of years ago were quite violent and fought all the time and eliminated many species. And what ice ages definitely contributed to the end of many large creatures, but human beings did as well because they didn't want these large things like saber-toothed tigers, which I think still existed 10,000 years ago. Didn't want them eating our young and so on. So it says here some of that involved original inventions and discoveries, some of it from Asia. But what was so remarkable was the way that the full capacities of new technology were recognized and widely adopted. By the 10th century, Europe already was far ahead in terms of farming equipment and technology or techniques, had unmatched capacities in the use of water and wind power, and possessed superior military equipment and tactics, not to be overlooked in all that medieval progress was the invention of a whole new way to organize and operate commerce and industry. Capitalism. Yeah, absolutely. The wonder also is why the Chinese didn't take advantage of a lot of their biggest inventions. Why is it that the Europeans took advantage of what is it, black powder? Why did they take a greater advantage of printing presses and so on? I think a big part of it was printing religious documents like the Bible, right? But nevertheless, they used that to teach people how to read, and that's made it so that far more people could go out and invent other things. Capitalism was developed by great monastic estates. Throughout the medieval era, the church was by far the largest landowner in Europe, and its liquid assets and annual income probably exceeded that of all of Europe's nobility added together. And that's another thing why historically people have not liked merchants, right? Like in ancient Japan, those merchants would sell things, they'd make money, and the ancient samurais thought that they should always be at the bottom, that they were the lowest of all castes. But then they would make more money, and it would make people very unhappy. I think similar things have happened to Jewish people over time, and they engaged in merchant activities. In ancient times, and made more money, and people were envious of that. So, but also in payment for liturgical services, Henry VII of England made a huge sum to have 10,000 masses said for his soul. Wow. As rapid innovation in agricultural technology began to yield large surpluses to the religious orders, the church not only began to reinvest profits to increase production, but diversified, having substantial amounts of cash on hand. The religious orders began to lend money at interest. They soon evolved the mortgage, literally, dead pledge, to lend money with land for security, collecting all income from the land during the term of the loan, none of which was deducted from the amount owed. That practice often added to the monastery's lands because the monks were not hesitant to foreclose. Could you imagine being foreclosed on by a monk? Wow. Okay. In addition, many monasteries began to rely on a hired labor force and to display an uncanny ability to adopt the latest technological advances. Capitalism had arrived. Still, like all the other world's major religions for centuries, Christianity took a dim view of commerce as the many great Christian monastic orders maximized profits and lent money at whatever rate of interest the market would bear. They were increasingly subject to condemnations from more traditional members of the clergy who accused them of avarice. Given the fundamental commitment of Christian theologians to reason and progress, what they did was rethink the traditional teachings. What is just a price for one's goods, they asked. According to immensely influential Saint Albertus Magnus, the just price is simply what goods are worth according to the estimate of the market at the time of sale. Wow, I didn't know that one actually. That's pretty interesting because that's not the Austrians are attributed with coming up with marginal utility, and this idea that the price of goods are determined by um, you know are circumstantial based on events. And Adam Smith said in Wealth of Nations as well, a century earlier than the Austrians, that he expressed the diamond water paradox, which is this idea that the price of diamonds can vary based on circumstance, and the price of water can as well. If you're in the middle of the desert dying of thirst, you gladly pay more for water than you would for a diamond, because a diamond's not going to save your life when you're dying of thirst. So it's pretty interesting. It's pretty interesting. I wonder if Adam Smith was reading Albertus Magnus in the 1100s. Wow. Adam Smith would have agreed. Yeah, definitely. St. Thomas Aquinas did. As for usury, a host of leading theologians of the day remained opposed to it, but quickly defined it out of practical existence. For example, no usury was involved if the interest was paid to compensate the lender for the cost of not having the money available for other commercial opportunities, which was almost always easily demonstrated. That was a remarkable shift. Men who had separated themselves from the world, and most of them had taken vows of poverty. Interestingly, a lot of ancient knighthoods did that as well. The Templar Knights were supposed to remain in poverty, although they became one of the largest banks that the world has ever seen. Part of the reason was you could go in Europe, give your money to the Templar Knights, make your pilgrimage to the Middle East, where they would give you your money back, which was quite surprising at the time. And the Templar Knights would not just help Christians, but also Jews make these pilgrimages. But eventually that stopped after the Muslims took over the Middle East and would just start murdering anyone, Christian or Muslim, who tried to move there. And still to this day, there's no pilgrimages for Christians and Jewish people to the Middle East, really, not like there once was. For all their genuine acts of charity, monastic administrators were not about to give all their wealth to the poor, sell their products at cost, or give kings interest-free loans. It was the active participation of the great orders in free markets that caused monastic theologians to reconsider the morality of commerce. So that's pretty interesting. I mean, again, I think that there's only so many people you can help, and that's kind of unfortunate. When it comes to charity, you do have to make sure you have enough to eat, and the people that are immediately close to you. And the reality of the world is that once those things are taken care of, it tends to be when people engage in other charitable endeavors. But if you give away everything that you have, it makes it difficult to continue doing productive things to help other people. So, um, probably shouldn't read all of this, but this article from independent.org is pretty good. I do like this part. Augustine, Aquinas, and other major theologians taught that the state must respect private property and not intrude on the freedom of its citizens to pursue virtue. In addition, there was the central doctrine that regardless of worldly inequalities, inequality in the most important sense does not exist. In the eyes of God in the world to come, as Paul explained, there is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither bond nor free, there is neither male nor female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus. And I think that's also one of the major successes of Christianity, to say that you can have a direct relationship with God and with Jesus without some sort of exception to the rule. That really raises up regular people, raises up us plebs that otherwise may not be too important, to something a little bit bigger. Say, yeah, we do matter, and we don't have to go through a king or a queen to gain that sort of understanding in the West. So, and church theologians and leaders meant it. Through all prior recorded history, slavery was universal. Christianity began in a world where as much as half the population was in bondage. But by the 7th century, Christianity had become the only major world religion to formulate specific theological opposition to slavery, and by no later than the 11th century. And let's remember, the Muslim world was doing what? Engaging in massive amounts of castration, a massive amount, creating child armies, right? The Janissaries and the Mamluks, they would often kill their parents and then force them to be raised as Muslim soldiers. And the Christians were like, nah, I'd rather not. So slavery was vigorously condemned by popes, and all the eventual abolition movements were of religious origins. So we don't want to understate the efforts of other Christians to end slavery in the West. Huge efforts were made in the United States, for example, that didn't heavily involve Catholics as much. Protestant Quakers, I guess. Quakers were one of the biggest movements for the abolition movement, and they all deserve respect because they all were pushing for amazing things. I mean, what is more important than ending slavery? Really, it's just horrible, horrible thing. So, free labor was an essential ingredient for the rise of capitalism. For free workers can maximize their rewards by working harder and more effectively than before. By free labor, they don't mean slavery. They should have been more specific there. They mean the freedom to choose your own job and pursue your own self-interest. That allowed people to do quite a bit more, and improve the lives of people around them. People are self-interested in improving the lives of others, right? There's only a small percentage of people in the world that are really interested in ending or destroying the world. A lot of those people are already in prison, fortunately. Sometimes they're dictators and so on, but it's not the norm for these people that want to destroy the world. Most people want to do good things and help others. Put another way, tyranny makes a few people richer. Capitalism can make everyone richer, right? Therefore, as the northern Italian city-states developed capitalist economies, visitors marveled at their standards of living. Many were equally confounded by how hard everyone worked. Yeah, because if you can improve your circumstances and circumstances of your family, what bigger motivator is there than that? The common denominator in all of these great historical developments was the Christian commitment to reason. That was why the West was won. All right, nice job, Rodney W. Stark. I don't know who you are, but that was a good essay that I needed to share with other people. So this first commenter is unhappy. I don't want to read it. I read it earlier. But But some of these other comments are kind of interesting. But we're going to end this video here. Thanks for listening. Please check out more in the future.